Hi, my name is Dr. Eliana Ramirez. I am the founder of Hostile Workplace Recovery, LLC, and I'm here to share some information with you about a really exciting upcoming professional group coaching program that I'm initiating with several of my favorite people from LinkedIn. If we haven't met before, I am a licensed independent social worker. I'm a researcher of racial and LGBTQ related workplace trauma, and I'm a professional coach. And I created Hostile Workplace Recovery LLC to center the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and LGBTQIA2S people who experience disproportionate levels of workplace abuse and stress. And I have created this DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, post-traumatic growth group coaching program because, of course, right now we are seeing a huge increase in the number of people who are in DEI roles who are being fired or forced out of their positions. And while a layoff can be terribly traumatic for anyone, for people who do DEI work, especially BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, other people of color, LGBTQIA2S folks, people who are living with disabilities, people who are neurodivergent or who have a faith other than Christianity, we oftentimes will experience concentrated levels of discrimination and stress. And when we think about racial trauma, especially, it can be just devastating to be doing the kind of work that challenges systemic inequity, that creates environments that are hopefully more inclusive and create a greater sense of belonging for people who are historically underrepresented and underestimated, frankly. When we do this work in systems that are unwilling to change, it's like we end up with a concentrated level of discrimination. If you can imagine the way that sunlight goes through a magnifying glass, when the light goes through the glass, it really actually burns the target of that light. And my experience of having done DEI work for many years led me to realize that that's what happens to so many of us who do DEI work, because we're not just experiencing the pushback from colleagues who do not want the status quo to change, but we're also oftentimes hearing the stories of our colleagues, our BIPOC, LGBTQIA2S, and other colleagues who are sharing with us their own experiences of workplace trauma. And so we end up with secondary trauma, oftentimes, hearing those stories. So when we're suddenly fired, it really can just be devastating, not only to our careers, but frankly, to our physical health and our mental health. And that is exactly the reason why I created this group. So this is hopefully a brief informational session. Just want to give you a heads up about what the group is about, and really kind of put into context a bit of what we're seeing right now with the DEI backlash. So we know from research that DEI can actually make a huge difference. We know that inclusive teams that are diverse in terms of race, ethnicity actually produce more by 35% over less diverse teams. We see that there are 2.5 times higher revenue per employee in diverse teams when we are surrounded by colleagues who are different than we are, who have different educational backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, values. It leads to more creativity and innovation in the workplace. We also know that there's been a huge kind of pendulum swinging back and forth in the last several years. So in 2020, we saw a massive amount of money being spent on DEI initiatives. In fact, U.S. corporations spent $3.4 billion. And this was largely attributed to the work of the Black Lives Matter movement, who were really forcing corporations to put commitment into systemic anti-racism following the highly publicized murders of many Black people at the hands of police. In 2019 and to 2022, we saw a massive increase in DEI leadership positions to the tune of 168.9%, posted to LinkedIn alone. But we also saw from 2018 to 2021 a massive turnover of staff. so-called chief diversity officers, which I and many from Indigenous communities have called attention to, that the term chief really is a term of reverence that should only be used within Indigenous communities, and frankly was inappropriate to attach to these leadership positions that are about diversity, equity, inclusion. And 60% of the people who were in those chief DEI positions actually left their positions between 2018 and 2021. In 2020, we saw a massive commitment, or at least pledges, by corporations who wanted to so-called close the racial wealth gap in this country. They were making promises of committing $50 billion. Well, the next year, only $250 million of those dollars actually came to fruition. So we see a significant amount of institutional inauthentic allyship, frankly, where people will say the right things, but then don't back it up. And that was not just in terms of the pledges that corporations were making, but even in the nonprofit world, in higher education, in healthcare systems. We saw many companies or employers that would hire people into DEI leadership positions. And when the person actually did the work to call attention to the systemic oppression that was happening in these employment places, the person would actually be forced out of the company or of the organization. And so it can be especially injurious to people who come into these positions believing that the companies really did want them to do their job of diversity, equity, inclusion, only to find out that, in fact, they were met with betrayal and backlash for having threatened the status quo. We see in 2022 a disproportionate rate of layoffs among people who are in DEI positions. So at this point in 2022, we're seeing that the rate of DEI layoffs were 33% as compared to 21% in other job sectors. In 2023, we see a 20% of C-suite executives were planning to cut back or eliminate their DEI positions. Of the 80% who said that they remained committed to DEI, 87% of those said that it was actually harder for them, it was riskier to speak out on controversial issues. Of course, now in 2025, we are seeing a massive backlash where major corporations and the federal government are ending DEI programs, essentially almost overnight. I'm so grateful to Lily Zhang, who posted on LinkedIn this last week the important and critical data that while the media is telling us about this huge backlash against DEI, there also is room for hope. And it's important to identify that 65% of companies are actually maintaining their DEI budgets and activities. Lily pointed out that there's actually a 22% increase that 22% of these companies are actually even increasing their spending. So at this point in time, it's really important for us to think carefully about our news sources and the stories they're telling us, and who benefits and at whose expense is the story being told in the way that it is. I've heard some people recently critiquing the idea of DEI backlash as a concept, because what we've seen is that as people are being laid off or forced out of companies through what's called constructive discharge, they are made so uncomfortable, they are undermined, sabotaged, resources are kept from them, they're left out of meetings, essentially to make them ineffective. Eventually, people end up leaving these positions because they are made sick by the positions, or they realize that there's no way that they will be able to do the work that they are so deeply committed to doing. And so they end up leaving their positions on their own. During this period of people being laid off from DEI positions and people being forced out of DEI positions, we're seeing a disproportionate level of job loss among Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Folks who are white complected, folks who are heterosexual, folks who identify as being able-bodied, actually have a much higher rate of staying in their positions. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that the backlash that's happening is falling more heavily on the shoulders of people who are underestimated and underrepresented in the workforce in the first place. The amazing Dr. Yvonne Taylor has this incredible article that's entitled "What Banning Diversity and Inclusion Efforts Really Mean." And I cannot speak highly enough about this article. I really encourage everyone to go ahead and check it out. I'll put the link to the article below this recording. But in this article, Dr. Taylor points out that we have seen this happen throughout the history of the United States. So following Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved Black men received the right to vote, received the right to own property, then we saw Jim Crow laws that came up to pull back that power from Black communities. After Black men were discharged from World War II, veterans came home and they demanded equal treatment, having made so many sacrifices for this nation. Well, that was responded to with the erection of Confederate statues and redlining practices across the nation, again, pulling back the power that had been accessed during that time. We saw also Brown versus Board of Education, followed by white private Christian schools and homeschooling movement taking money from public education systems. So what we're seeing right now is in context and consistent with the kind of backlash that has happened whenever people of color, and especially Black people, end up with a little bit more power, a little bit more access to resources in the country. There is a following pattern where laws are changed, physical places are changed, like the erection of these statues, and the way that society is organized is even changed, as we saw in the public school system. So today's backlash, again, thanks to Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor mentions that our contemporary multi-pronged attack from conservatives against DEI is really in several different areas. We see anti-critical race theory rhetoric. There's been book banning in K through 12 schools. Of course, this anti-DEI legislation in public institutions. And there has been a continued increase in murders of Black people by police. We saw in 2019, there were 1,004 people who were reported as having been murdered by police, and that actually increased in 2023 to 1,247 Black people who were murdered. So I share this information, this data, for several reasons. One is because I want to communicate directly to people who have been in DEI positions, who have been doing this work out of commitment to community, knowing that systems can change when we hold people accountable, when we share the actual data of what happens to businesses, how they benefit by having a diverse workforce. I also want to acknowledge that for many of us who have been doing this DEI work, this is not theoretical. This is not apolitical. We are doing this work out of love for our communities. And so when we are undermined, sabotaged, bullied, mobbed out of our jobs, it comes at a huge price to our, again, mental health and our physical health, not to mention, obviously, our financial health and our careers and professions. I want to pause for a second on this slide because it is so important to share with everyone that it is not uncommon when people are bullied or mobbed or suddenly fired from their jobs to have such overwhelming pain and distress that they will actually end up with suicidal ideation. That is, having thoughts that the only way they can think of to making the pain stop is to end their own lives. Following the untimely passing of Dr. Antoinette Candia Bailey, who was bullied to death in her job at Lincoln University, I created a Black Women Toxic Job Survivor Suicide Prevention Guide. And I encourage you to pull out your phones and use that QR code that's on the right-hand side. This suicide prevention guide not only has resources about how to keep yourself as safe as possible if you have these feelings. This means things like locking up guns, separating bullets from guns. Until things get a little bit better, consider maybe even asking a trusted friend or family member to take the guns or the bullets from your home. If you have large amounts of medications at your home, it's a really important idea to reduce the amount of medications at home. So again, you can ask somebody to take anything more than a 3-day supply and hold it for you outside of the home. If you have old expired medications, you can go to your local pharmacy. They oftentimes will have drop boxes where you can safely dispose of those medications. Please don't throw medications in toilets. It goes into the water system. But there are many, many things that you can be doing right now to keep yourself as safe as possible at home, because the feelings of suicidal crisis pass if we give them time to pass. It is not a sign of weakness if these thoughts come up. It is not something that a person can pray away or positive think their way through. In fact, it happens at a nervous system level. You might have heard of the concept of fight, flight, and freeze. So if we are unable to effectively fight off a danger and we cannot escape that danger, that's when the nervous system crashes. Think of it just like a lizard who's being chased by a hawk. The lizard might kind of fall limp. Possums do this, or deer in caught in headlights, they'll freeze as well. The reason why this happens at a nervous system level is it's actually an ancient survival response, ironically enough. When that lizard is being chased by that huge hawk, if it goes limp, then the hope is that the hawk will pass that lizard to go find other prey, because the hawk will think that the lizard is actually dead. Well, the same thing happens to our nervous systems. And it's not a sign of weakness at all. It is an automatic process that actually happens prior to conscious thought. So it's really, really important when that nervous system reaction happens automatically that we have reduced our access to means that could be used to harm ourselves in the moment. And so this Toxic Job Suicide Prevention Guide also has information about activities that you can do to help yourself. One of the best things that you can do is get yourself into a whole bunch of really cold water. When we can jump into a super cold shower, jump into a super cold bath, or even taking an ice pack, putting it against the back of your neck, or submerging your face in really cold water for like 15 to 30 seconds, coming up for air and then going back in. When we do these things, it activates the vagus nerve that connects the brain to all of the organs in our body to help to slow everything down. And when we can slow down the automatic chain reaction of stress hormones that become released when we go into that fight, flight, or freeze stage, eventually then the thinking part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, can come back online, and we can start to think about alternative options to suicide. So again, I really hope that folks will go ahead and download this guide and share it with people around you. It is written for Black women, and there are many resources in it that can be useful to anybody. But I specifically made it for Black women in honor of Dr. Candia Bailey, and because right now in the United States, Black women ages 18 to 65 have the highest rate of suicide among all groups of women in this country. But we're not talking about this because of misogynoir, because of the combination between racism and sexism in this country. Okay, so moving right along in this presentation, my goal for creating this group, this post-traumatic group for DEI providers who have been fired or forced out of their jobs, is because I know that we can heal from trauma and we can help ourselves considerably when we have access to information that explains what just happened to our lives. When we have access to information about how our brains become changed by chronic racial stress and trauma. When we have access to information about how our amazing cultural backgrounds can help us to survive this moment, just like all of our ancestors who came before us. Because we're here right now because our ancestors figured out something really important about survival. And so this coaching group is not therapy. This coaching group is not going to provide legal advice. This coaching group will help you, if you decide to join us, to identify what your personal and professional goals are for post-traumatic growth, and then provide you resources and information so that you can pursue that on your own. In that toxic job guide that I had the QR code for on the previous slide, there are very long lists of resources where you can find a therapist, where you can find therapeutic support groups, even where you can find an employment attorney, should you want to go there. But this is group coaching. It's designed from a trauma-informed and healing-centered perspective. So trauma-informed from the Centers for Disease Control idea of trauma-informed practices. This means that I am providing participants with information so that there's as much transparency as possible. People know what's going to happen before it happens, where participants have maximum self-determination, have the benefit of connecting with peers who have lived experience through the exact same institutional betrayal, which is exactly what happens when a company hires us to do DEI work and then fires us or forces us out when we actually start to make systemic change. The healing-centered approach, this is from Sean Ginwright's brilliant work in 2018. He talks about how the trauma-informed approach really is a singular approach. It's looking at an individual person and helping that individual person who has a traumatic history to have as much sense of safety and control over what's happening right now. That's looking at the individual person almost as if there's a problem with that individual person. Sean Ginwright says, well, wait a minute. If we need to think about systemic racism, we need to think about, of course, large groups of communities of color are going to have higher rates of things like anxiety and depression because we are being harmed in a systemic way in society. And so the healing-centered approach is really contextualizing the difficulties, the emotional challenges, the physical health challenges that we accrued in hostile workplaces, and contextualizing that not as a problem of us. There's nothing wrong with us. When people are hurt, they feel hurt. That's what happens to all mammals, and that's what's happened to us. So we're contextualizing this within the larger social justice framework. You can see where my theoretical orientations come from. So critical race theory, Chicana feminisms, queer theory, neuroscience, somatic self-help practice, and importantly, the peer movement. So this is, we know that when people who have gone through these kinds of challenges, whether they happen to be with a mental health experience or any other lived experience, that there's something really unique that happens when you survive that, no amount of education or degrees can match, right? So if you are a DEI backlash survivor and you go in to see a therapist, for example, that therapist might be very well trained, but if they themselves have never been in the role of a DEI leader who's trying to make systemic change, they may not understand the ways that that system collapses on the person and retaliates against their work, because it doesn't make sense, right? Why in the world would a company hire a person to do this systemic change work and then actually fire them and retaliate against them when they do that work? So when we can be around other people who've had this lived experience, we can not only have oftentimes an automatic understanding from the other person, so we don't have to explain so much to them the background of what we're feeling, but we also get the benefit of realizing, oh, wait a minute. Your company responded in this kind of a way to you, and this is how they forced you out. Wait, this company over here, they did the exact same thing. It's in a totally different industry. It's in a totally different position, but it was the same kind of practice. What do I mean by this? For example, an employee is experiencing racism from a colleague. They will do what the employee handbook says. If you've got a problem interpersonally that you can't handle on your own, take it to HR. So they go and they report it to HR. What does HR do? They turn around and they defend the company rather than the employee who's experiencing the racism. And they do what Dr. Jennifer Freyd talks about, which is called DARVO: defend, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And in this process, they turn the person who's making the complaint into the problem. This is where we see the racist, sexist trope of the angry Black woman, for example. Even though Most Black women in all workplaces have to be extremely controlled in their facial expressions, in the tone of their voice, in the words that they use, because that racial trope is so pervasive. And so it can be really, really helpful to be around other, not only workplace abuse survivors, but people who are specifically doing DEI work, because the unique ways that institutional betrayal happen are so bizarre, frankly. They're so illogical that for somebody who's never been in this kind of work, it can be hard for them to understand. Okay, so this group is informed by my 20 years of doing anti-racist work, LGBTQIA2S affirming work at a group level. I've designed multiple interventions. I've facilitated multiple group level interventions that have to do with these kinds of DEI issues, specifically in the workplace. And I have also evaluated these programs for many years. This program, again, is not group therapy. This is group coaching, but I have designed it from that background. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of the group. So it's a 2-hour group. The first hour we are in, and it's all done on Zoom. The first hour is in one big Zoom room, and we'll probably have somewhere between 20 and 50 people in attendance. And I will be presenting on various topics that have to do with workplace abuse, the impact of racial trauma on our physical health, on our mental health, things like how to best protect ourselves when we're in an abusive workplace, how to identify the warning signs when we're on the job market that we might be applying to a position that is actually based in inauthentic allyship or systemic racism that is nobody wants to change, and we want to pass that job opportunity up and move on to the next. So I will be sharing information that really is about employee self-defense and recovery on a self-help basis from the injury of racial trauma. The second hour, we're going to be going into small breakout rooms, affinity groups. And these will have somewhere between 10 to 12 people, and they will be facilitated discussions. And I'm going to move the slides along so you can see it. The amazing facilitators. I am so honored to be working with these incredible people. So Dr. Carrie Yazid, many of you might be familiar with her astoundingly phenomenal workbook. It's called Unbreak My Soul: How Black Women Can Begin to Heal Workplace Trauma. Dr. Carrie Yazid is going to be facilitating a small group for Black women. The incredible Carrie Page, who is a citizen of the Métis Nation and an advocate for silenced voices, she is going to be leading a group for Indigenous women. Jaya Malik is an incredible content creator on LinkedIn, who is also the founder of Jaya Malik Coaching and Consulting. She is going to be facilitating a breakout room for women of color who are not Indigenous or Black women. Michael Thornhill is going to be facilitating a small breakout room for men, and I will be facilitating a small breakout room for LGBTQIA2S identified people. For our white DEI folks who have had the same experience of backlash, I will be setting up another cohort specifically for white people, because the kinds of challenges that can happen for white people can be very different than for people of color, and vice versa in a DEI backlash kind of scenario. And so I'm very excited to do both cohorts. And this particular session is talking about the BIPOC cohort. So these are going to be on Wednesdays from 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific, 6 to 8 Central Time, and 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The start date is going to begin in February as soon as we have enrolled at least 20 people. And this is the agenda. So the first hour will include that 40-minute didactic presentation that I mentioned. I build all of my online curriculum in a multimedia manner. So there will be music, there will be Padlets, there will be online opportunities for folks to engage with one another. So there'll be Zoom polling and use of the chat. And then we're going to do a 5-minute somatic skill building and resource sharing. And if you're not familiar with the term somatic, it's about the body. It's about how we can help our nervous system to feel a greater sense of safety and interrupt that stress hormone flooding process that can happen when we have been in chronically dangerous environments like hostile workplaces. Then we're going to do a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we will then go into our breakout rooms by affinity group. We'll be there for 50 minutes. As I said, they are facilitated discussions. And then everyone will come back together and we will do a 10-minute report out from the different groups and a 5-minute closing and exercise. So our weekly topics, intentionally, this is that trauma-informed and healing-centered approach. I'm starting off the very first sessions, focusing on resource, focusing on the things that strengthen us, focusing on connecting our community to one another in a way so that we can support each other when we get into more discussion about the workplace trauma itself. So the first week, we're talking about somatic resourcing, things that we can do with our individual bodies and things that we can do in a collective to help ourselves kind of make sense of what just happened to our lives, but also support us so that we have less injury and less chance of being re-traumatized when we get into the heavier topics. Week 2 is really focusing on interoception. That is our awareness of our own bodies, how they're feeling. So when we feel a high level of stress, there's a tipping point. If that stress continues and we're unable to fight or flee, that's when we have that crash that I mentioned before, that freeze reaction. So interoception helps us to start to become aware, what does it feel like in our bodies when that stress level is getting higher and higher and higher, so that we can interrupt it before it tips all the way over to the other side of the freeze response. And then we're also going to be talking about our radical love for ourselves, our BIPOC selves, because too often people who are bullied and mobbed out of jobs are some of the brightest, some of the most compassionate, committed subject matter experts that are out there, who also have quite a bit of integrity. And so when we are forced out of these jobs, we oftentimes will look back and say, well, gosh, is there something that I could have done differently? Or why didn't I realize how dangerous the situation actually was? Or why did I freeze when I was in that meeting and they were being so cruel, or whatever it might be? The fact that we reflect on ourselves and say, oh, could I have done something differently, is really a good thing. It's a wonderful part of who we are. And in a situation like this, it can lead to rumination, where the brain gets on a continuous, unstoppable loop, and it's stressful thoughts and distressing thoughts that end up releasing stress hormones. So our bodies just become inundated with stress hormones, which over time can lead to system-wide inflammation and actually are precursors to things like diabetes, cancer, obesity, heart disease, and other illnesses that are associated with metabolic illnesses. So it's really, really important that part of our professional post-traumatic growth really is focusing on our health and our bodies. And one way to do that is to counter the internalized negativity that happens when we're in hostile workplaces with self-love and connection in our community. Then in week 3, we're going to go further into resources for restorative moments within toxic jobs, because let's be honest here. In a toxic society, there are very few jobs that don't have some level of chronic and toxic stress to them. So while we're in there, we do want to know about, well, what do we have access to? Things like employee assistance programs, family medical leave, disability insurance, and finding a therapist. I've also created numerous activities that people can do on their own, such as mapping autonomic workplace wellness. Weeks 4 through 6, now we're getting into the neuroscience of racial stress, how chronic racial stress actually changes brain structure and brain function. We're going to be looking at things like racial battle fatigue, race lighting, which is gaslighting, a psychological manipulation technique that is supercharged by racist tropes and racism. And we're also going to be talking about weathering, the ways in which that chronic stress hormone flooding leads to early onset disability and shorter lifespan. In fact, in one study that was looking at Black graduates of historically Black colleges and universities compared to Black graduates of predominantly white institutions, the Black graduates of PWIs actually had 35% more metabolic illness, that's inflammation-related illnesses that I mentioned previously, 35% more metabolic illness if they went to PWIs as compared to the HBCUs. And this was after controlling for diet, after controlling for exercise. And so really the variable was the exposure to these predominantly white institutions that had such a massive impact on the Black graduates' health. Week 5, we're going to be talking about embodied stress, racial stress recovery. So how we can use that vagus nerve that I mentioned before, how we can use different things in our bodies to help us to interrupt that stress hormone flooding and start to bring down some of the inflammation, as well as the mental health capacities that we have. Many of us, after we get out of abusive workplaces or where there was chronic stress at work, we might find that it's harder to pay attention. It takes us longer to learn new information. Maybe we read a page and we have to read it over and over again before the information kind of makes sense. We might find that we have challenges with short-term memory. Our mood might be significantly impacted in such a way that we want to kind of isolate from others, which is really hard if we're working on a team and we need to be engaged with others. So there are numerous cognitive changes that happen when we are under chronic stress and chronic racial stress. And we'll be getting into some of the research as well about how we can help our bodies to start to recover from some of that. Week 6, we're really talking about the tools of institutional betrayal and other DEI backlash, because most of us were never trained in how to spot that institutional betrayal before it happens. We followed what the employee handbook said we should do by making a report to HR, for example, and didn't know that there are very specific ways that people will try to force us out of an organization, right? That they might say, oh, I didn't leave you off that meeting invite on purpose. That was a mistake. And we might not realize that people are starting to not talk to us, not showing up to meetings that we had scheduled, right? So there are multiple ways that people are passively and actively pushed out of workplaces. We're going to start to share some of that here. Week 7 through 10, week 7, we're talking about hostile work environment self-defense. So how we can use things. We do need to make reports to HR that discrimination is happening, especially if it is if there's a employment law that protects us because of our racial identity, our gender, our sexual orientation, or what have you. But to know before we make that report how to do so in a way that will create as many options for us as possible. Should we need to advocate for severance pay? Should we need to file a lawsuit later? So spoiler alert, what this means is we never want to give a verbal report to HR. It should always be in writing. And we always want to keep a copy of that at home with us on our own so that we have it should we end up being retaliated against by the HR. I am not an attorney, and as I said, we will not be giving any kind of legal advice, but we will help people to figure out how to find an employment attorney. For many people, they might think that they're not sure if they have a case. They wouldn't even know how to begin to talk to various attorneys. So we'll be sharing some of that kind of information so that people can have the greatest self-determination on their own. Then in week 8, we're talking about personal reasons to stay or leave a hostile work environment. And it is going to be different for everyone. Not everyone can just walk away from a job. And so we really have to think carefully about the equations that we kind of run through in our brains, because oftentimes we don't have all the information. There's a thing called stress-induced analgesia. This is when we are under direct threat that the body will not allow us to know how severe our physical injuries are until we get away from that threat. It's not until we get away from, the hostile work environment that suddenly, oftentimes, massive pain will start to emerge. Because when we're in that environment, the body needs all of our energy to be ready to fight or flee, not to start to repair that injury. So when we think, I've got retirement in another year, I can just hold it out for one more year, we may not realize that our blood levels are going off the charts in terms of our cholesterol or other things that are becoming unbalanced in our physical health. And so we'll be talking about some of the things to consider that many of us were never trained in. And also, if we're people of color, especially if we come from immigrant families, many of us, our jobs, our education are directly tied to sacrifices that other family members have made for us. And so it can be really complex to just think about resigning from a job where we are being physically or psychologically injured because other people have made sacrifices for us to get to that point in the first place, or because the kinds of labor that our family has historically done involves such danger that is very different from the kinds of danger that we experience when we are thought workers in, a white collar office. So, for example, my experience, my grandfather was a migrant farm worker, and he was exposed to all sorts of toxins, pesticides in the fields. And in my most hostile work environment experience, I would tell myself, well, it's not as bad as what he went through. Little did I know that the toxins that are the invisible glue in abusive workplaces are actually, in some cases, even more dangerous to one's health. So then we're going to go into week 9, where we'll be talking about exit planning on your own terms, giving some links and resources so that you can learn a little bit about negotiating severance pay, how to, learn about, well, what are the laws in your state? Because they are different by state. And then if you decide that you want to leave your job, how to find a job and kind of screen for those risk factors or those red flags that there might be performative or inauthentic allyship in the next job. And then finally, week 10, we're bringing it all together. This is when we are going to rejoin, remember, bring all parts of ourselves back together and reconnect with our community as well as our future, the vision that we have for ourselves that oftentimes we lose due to workplace trauma. As I mentioned, these groups will happen on Zoom. Everyone who's going to attend the group has to go through a 30-minute intake call with me. This is just to make sure that I get an opportunity to answer any questions that you might have and to ensure that this group might be a good fit for you. And so, for example, if you are living with mental health challenges, to ensure that you have resources in your life already to support you for the mental health challenges, because again, this is not therapy. This is group coaching. And sometimes big emotions can come up. So I just want to make sure that folks have the support in the rest of their lives that's necessary to be able to do this kind of group coaching. And then finally, there's going to be a lot of really cool freebies in between the sessions each week. If you want to go further into your own self-help, I'll be providing activities that you can use on your own. So who is this for? This is for the DEI workforce who've experienced workplace abuse. You might be somebody who had DEI in your title, or you might have just shown up to work, and because of the amount of melanin in your skin, you were forced to run programs that had to do with cultural issues in the workplace, or maybe you were compelled on your own to make sure that younger or newer staff who are coming in, who are also people of color, LGBTQ folks, to ensure that they were able to access mentorship that you didn't have available to you. So regardless of whether or not DEI was in your job title or it was something that you did, even though it wasn't in your job title, if you've had this experience, you would be welcome to connect to see if this would be a good group for you. So everyone who participates, we're going to have a zero tolerance policy for any kind of discriminatory language or behaviors. It's really important that we have a place that is as psychologically safe as possible for our participants. This is not a place for competition. We have got to abandon competition. This is not a place for hierarchy. This is a place for us to come together and be able to feel comfortable disclosing whatever level of sharing we want to about our own workplace experiences. And it can't happen if we're in an environment that we feel like we need to be positioning ourselves against other people in this space. And then this is not, again, it's not therapy, it's not group therapy. So we ask that you not give advice to other people unless they have invited it. And then finally, I especially hope that we will have large numbers of LGBTQIA2S people who would join us, that people who are living with neurodiversity, people who are immigrants, people who are Muslim and other faiths, people who are older adults, people living with disabilities, that especially all of these communities who are historically underrepresented and underestimated in the workplace join this group coaching cohort. So the group coaching program, the full price program is $1,000 for 10 sessions, which comes down to $50 an hour. We do have an early bird discount, 15% off. So through February 19th, you can get the 15% off discount at $850. If you'd like further discount, if you bring in one person who registers, you both can get 40% off. So both of you would end up paying $600. If you bring in two people, those two people both pay the $600 40% off fee, and you would get 80% off. So at that point, you're only paying $200 for this program. If you can find 3 people to bring into the program who each pay $600, the 40% off discount, not only will you have free tuition, but we will actually pay you $200. I've set this up on purpose because I really, really want to make sure that 2 things happen. One is that DEI providers who have been forced out of their workplaces suddenly, for whom many of us, finances are going to be tight, have an option to access this material, but also that I'm able to make sure that our amazing group facilitators are paid for their work. So that's why I've created this outreach scholarship option. If you are financially fortunate enough that you have extra resources and you would like to pay it forward, we would very much appreciate a contribution that we would give to another person who is unable to pay for tuition. So if any of this sounds of interest to you, please do use the QR code that's on the screen right now, and this will enable you to set up a 30-minute call with me. It's just an individual call to answer any questions you might have and to ensure that this group might be a good match for you. And this is an intake survey. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this session, what I've shared with you today. If you are even the least bit interested in participating, I would love to hear your feedback about what resonated, what the topics were that were of interest to you, and to hear from you what your questions might be. So with that, I just want to thank you all so very much for being here, for participating. Thank you for the people who put comments in the chat. Unfortunately, I'm logging in through StreamYard, so I can't actually see your name. So I just see that a LinkedIn user at 6:53 p.m. said that it sounds like you've done a lot of research. Great job on the presentation. Thank you so much for sharing that feedback. I appreciate that. And then I see another LinkedIn user at 7 p.m. saying, I wish K-12 schools would proudly show these resources to students. I do as well. If there's anyone else who's in the audience who has a question or a comment, and if you're in LinkedIn right now, I welcome you to share that with me. The last thing that I will share with you, just to create a couple more moments here so that people can ask questions or leave comments in the chat, I am going to pull up my website so that you can see what the page is that you would go to on my website if you would like to learn more about this project. So as I said, I am at Hostile Workplace Recovery, and this is the DEI Backlash Survivor Group coaching page where you can learn more about what I've just shared. And then on the bottom of the page are the different options that you can choose. So we've got that 15% off. If you'd like to use that 15% off code, you're more than welcome to. You just click on that one single bird, and then it brings you up to the page. And as you can see, there are multiple options for payments. There are even installment payments if you would prefer to go that route. We'll go back to the other page here. So if you were going to do the 40% off, that means that you bring one person, you choose the 2-bird image here, and that would bring you down to that cost down here. Now, I am asking that you not purchase a slot before meeting with me. Please do schedule that 30-minute intake call so that we can make sure that this is a good match for you, what you're looking for, and so on. And then if you would like to bring in 2 people for the 80% off discount, you can do so here. And if you'd like to donate to a scholarship, this is a place to do so. All right, so I am going to come back here and just see if anyone else has left a question or comment. I don't see any that are here right now. So with that, I am going to close this out with one of my favorite songs, because I think it is so important that we spend time together in a way that brings our bodies and our nervous systems back to a place of resource as quickly as possible before we leave and move into the rest of the world, because my goodness, there's a lot going on this planet right now, and stress is high. And so with each session that I'm going to do, I'm bringing in lots and lots of resources, just like I did during this informational session. Also, I will be bringing in music, somatic exercises, so that these are things that you can take out to the rest of your life and hopefully can help you to feel a greater sense of calm, even when you are being exposed to extreme stressors, which are all over the place. We're in no shortage of extreme stressors in the world right now. So I am going to close this out with this incredible song. This is beautiful chorus, I Am, which is featuring India Ari. And while you're listening to the song, if you were to move back and forth like this, or forward and back, any kind of repetitive movement like that actually helps the nervous system to calm down and settle. Why? Because when we are in utero, that is this kind of sensation that we have when the mom was walking, right? And that oftentimes, this is why babies oftentimes, if they're crying, they will be cradled. It's causing a nervous system reset that helps to stop releasing stress hormones and instead start to releasing feel-good hormones like serotonin and oxytocin. So as you're listening to the song, feel free to move a little bit. That will increase the sense of relaxation for you. If you know the song, humming it, singing it, anytime that we make a vocal sound, especially an elongated vocal sound, it's actually activating that vagus nerve that is right back here, and it's close to our vocal box. So when we hum, when we sing, it can really help to settle the nervous system. Another thing that you can do is do what they call the hook in the ear. So if you put your fingers into your ear and then pull down and then start making a sound like humming, again, it's even more powerful for kind of like an automatic way to start to bring down the temperature on a nervous system. Okay, so with that, I'm going to take myself off screen, play the song for you. Blessings to all of you. I hope that you are as safe and healthy as possible in the world, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you so much for being here.
Welcome magic and wonder, brilliance and grace. Welcome joy, satisfaction, pleasure and strength. Welcome essence, beauty, presence, time, spirit, form and space. Welcome excellence in every blessing, sacred and praise. What I seek, I have. What I wanna know, I understand. All I wish I could, I can. Who I wanna be, I am. What I seek, I have. What I wanna know, I understand. All I wish I could, I can. Who I wanna be, I am. Ooh, 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 ooh. Welcome magic and wonder, brilliance and grace. Welcome joy, satisfaction, pleasure and strength. Welcome essence, beauty, presence, time, spirit, form, and space. Welcome excellence and every blessing, sacred and praise. What I see, I am. What I wanna know, I understand. Oh, I wish I could, I can. What I wanna be, I am. What I see, I am. What I wanna know, I understand. Oh, I wish I could, I can. Who I wanna be, I am. I am the seed, I am the tree. I am the flower, I am the bee. I am fire and I am wind. I accept love and also I give. I am loud and I am mighty. I am silent and I tread lightly. I am brave and monumental. I am modest, I am gentle. I am student and I teach. I am the sand and I am the beach. I am ease and I am power. I am bridge and I am power. I am peace and I am wild. I am mother, I am child. I am many, I am few. I am God and God is you. I see, I have. What I wanna know, I understand. Oh, I wish I could, I can. Who I wanna be, I am. What I seek, I have. What I wanna know, I understand. Oh, I wish I could, I can. Who I wanna be, I am.
Thank you all so much for being here, whether you joined us live or you watched this in after the recording was done. I really do hope that you'll reach out to me. Please do so through LinkedIn. I am available through DMs, or you can also contact me through these slides. I'll just put them up for one more moment. If you would like to schedule a call to learn more about this group, please do use this QR code here. And I'm so grateful for everyone who's here. And thank you to everyone who has done DEI work. Your work is not lost. Thank you for the good fight that you've done for our community. And we are here for you. This is a space where you can be around people who understand. And together we can help ourselves move towards post-traumatic growth. Thank you all so much.